Welcome to Chapter 2 on Racelighting. In this session, we will focus on an introduction to racelighting. In the prior two sessions, we've laid the foundation for understanding the antecedents of the racelighting process, such as white supremacy, white nationalism, anti-Blackness, anti-indigeneity. We talked about how these antecedents create two different types of bias, explicit bias and implicit bias. And we've talked about racial microaggressions, which are the common ways in which racialized messages are communicated to Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And these subtle snubs, dismissive looks, and daily put-downs serve to create an experience beginning even in the earliest levels of education, as we've demonstrated in our data, that can negatively impact Black, Indigenous, and people of color. We would like to highlight a racelighting brief that myself and my colleague Frank Harris wrote. It was actually the first brief that we did focused on racelighting. It's titled Racelighting in the Normal Realities of Black, Indigenous, and People of Color. And if you want to access the brief, you can go down to the link at the bottom of your screen. That's bmmcoalition.com/racelighting, or you can also just simply go to racelighting.net. That's racelighting.net. And this brief highlights the primary components of what racelighting is, which is essentially what happens when gaslighting is racial. But in order for us to talk about racelighting, we have to first step back and talk about the concept of gaslighting first. Gaslighting is a concept that comes from the 1938 play Gaslight that was written by Patrick Hamilton. In the play, there are two main characters, Jack and Bella, and Jack and Bella are married together, and Jack is a villain in this play, and Bella is the person who is being victimized by Jack. And Jack is intent upon making Bella feel as if she is losing her mind. So what Jack does is there are pictures and paintings that are on the wall. He takes those pictures and paintings down, he hides them, and then he accuses Bella of stealing them. And whenever Bella asserts her innocence and says that it wasn't me, I didn't move it, or he accuses her of lying, but he does so in a way to make her second guess herself and her memory in terms of whether or not she did indeed take the pictures down. He does the same thing in the kitchen with knives and forks and spoons. He also does the same thing with pensions and watches, hiding things and then accusing Bella of stealing them. There's also a person who serves as a maid within their home, and Jack openly hits on this individual in front of his wife, Bella. Bella sees this. She raises it to Jack's concern. Why are you hitting on this other woman? And Jack would, again, gaslight her by saying, that's not what happened. You're imagining things. That's not what you saw, and making her feel like it was her. Now, in the play, there is a secret room in the house that Bella does not realize is there. And in this secret room, Jack is banging around and he's looking for jewels. And I'm not going to tell you why. I'd love for you to see one of the film adaptations of Gaslight, such as Gaslight or Angel Street, or to even read the original play. But there's this hidden part of the house that Jack is in. And then he's also in there banging around looking for jewels. And Bella hears this noise. She hears audibly this banging and thumping around, and she brings it to Jack's attention. And Jack again responds by blaming her, saying that she's misinterpreting things, that she's hearing things, and suggesting that she's losing her mind. Now, in this part of the house, there was a gas light. And so when Jack would turn on the light in this part of the house that was hidden, and so what happened is if you had gas on or a gas light on in one part of the house and then a gas light on in another part of the house, there was less gas to go around. The gas would become more diffuse and the lights would dim and flicker. And Bella would see this visual change in her environment with the lights dimming and flickering, and she would bring it to Jack's attention, and he would again assert, well, you know how you imagine things, or why are you lying, or why are you making things up, or suggesting that she was losing her mind. And so this notion of gaslight is when someone systematically feeds false information to another individual in order to manipulate their perceptions, their experiences, their realities, their memories. It's a form of psychological control. In terms of a psychological context, the term gaslight was written about in the 60s and 70s in the psychological literature, but had a resurgence in the 2000s after the book The Gaslight Effect came out. This book was written by Dr. Robin Stern, who is a popular center director and psychologist. And what the book focuses on is how people can spot and survive the hidden manipulation others use to control their lives. And so in terms of the research that's been done and the works that have been done, scholarly works on gaslighting, it's been traditionally conceptualized as occurring in a heterosexual relationship between a man and a woman, where the man is the perpetrator and the woman is the individual who's being victimized by the man. So oftentimes viewed as being in this relationship, a controlling and domineering relationship between two individuals. The term hasn't been widely applied in issues of marginality. However, there have been some works that have happened that we're going to cover as part of this program that serve as a foundation for how we think about race lighting. So one area that is of interest to us and maybe of interest to you is that there has been some work that has been done looking at the impact of gaslighting on the LGBTIQ plus population. And in particular, it looks at how students send messages to other students and how those students, their families also send messages to them that essentially deny their identities and gaslight them. And so there's been some works that have expanded out this notion of gaslight to focus on other forms of marginality. And we also are attentive to some works that have been done focused in the area of race and racism.
There has been, as I mentioned, some work looking at this in a racial context. One is from Roberts and Andrews, who talk about gaslighting experience of African-American teachers. And they look at, after Brown versus the Board of Education, there was essentially a significant reduction in the amount of African-American teachers. And one of the reasons this occurred is that the ruling that came down essentially connoted that Black teachers, Black schools were lesser than. So therefore, we need to move away from that as options for Black students. And it gaslit the actual situation that was taking place, which is that the white families did not want their children being taught by Black teachers. And because of how integration was taking place, that was a strategy that they used to get rid of Black people. The next example comes from Davis and Ernst. And I have a screenshot of their paper on the right-hand side. They look at gaslighting in a racial context, and they actually have a term that they call racial gaslighting, which you'll see us apply here too, but in a slightly different context. And they define that as the political, social, and economic and cultural process that perpetuates and normalizes a white supremacist reality through pathologizing those who resist. And how she looks at this is, and her colleague look at this, is oftentimes through the lens of case law and policy. And in particular, they point out Korematsu versus the United States. There was internment, of course, of Japanese during the war. And essentially, Korematsu was someone who said, I don't want to report to the internment camp because that's not an internment camp, it's a concentration camp. And this is racial discrimination. And it went up through the courts. And the courts came back saying, well, this is actually not racial discrimination. This is about protecting the United States versus the Japanese Empire. And so it's an example of how gaslighting can play out in case law. And they provide other examples in there as well. The Commonwealth of Kentucky versus Braves, another example that you'll see. But they introduced this concept called, and they promote this concept called racial spectacles, which is essentially how there are narratives that are created by nation states to essentially advance hegemonic practices, systemic racism, and that those narratives serve to reinforce the gaslighting or racial gaslighting that people of color experience within the court systems and within case law. And they also do a really good job of noting of how these practices play out at a macro level, but they can also play down at a micro level and have an individual level impact as well. Gaslighting has also been talked about in terms of looking at racial profiling against Canadians of African descent. There's a really cool paper by Tobias and Joseph, 2020, where police officers were profiling Afro-Canadians. They would fill out these little cards with information about them. They were being stopped with no actual reason. The response from the police was, well, they have to stop. It's totally optional. Then they started talking about the difference between carding versus checks, and basically created this confusion around the fact that it was actually the same practice, saying, well, this practice over here is fine, this practice over here is better. And so really, this is about definitions. And so they were gaslighting people who were experiencing this. And again, looking at this in really more of a case law and court system context. Probably the closest to what we've looked at here, gaslighting as a framework for discussing the experience of women of color scientists by Rodriguez, Mendenhall, and Clancy, who look at how these types of messages also play out at a more interpersonal level for women of color scientists who experience the confluence of racial and gender microaggressions, but experience it in ways that make them question their own realities and capabilities.
Race lighting is an act of psychological manipulation, whereby people of color receive racial messages that distort their realities and lead them to second guess their own experiences and realities with racism. It is an act in that there are actions that take place verbally, non-verbally, with intent, without intent, that serve to sow doubt and disorientation among the race lighting, leading them to second guess themselves, their experiences, their perceptions, their knowledge, their capability, and even their own decision making. If you ever get to a point where you say to yourself, maybe I'm not as smart as I thought I was. Maybe I'm not as good as I thought I was. Maybe I don't belong here. It's that doubt, that disorientation. That's race lighting. As we've mentioned before, race lighting and gaslighting are similar in that race lighting is what happens when gaslighting is racial. But there are some key differences that are important for us to consider. The first difference is the centrality of race and racism. The centrality of race and racism. So you may be familiar with some of this language immediately seeing this because this also happens to be the first tenet of critical race theory, which is acknowledgement of the centrality of race and racism in accordance with its intersection with other forms of marginality. And so too in race lighting do we acknowledge that in order for something to be race lighting and not gaslighting, it has to be racial or deal with an issue of racism. It has to deal with someone denying someone's experience, someone perpetuating stereotypes that are meant to make someone second guess themselves, misrepresenting the past in different ways in order to make people feel like their contributions what they shouldn't have been. Ultimately, it deals specifically with issues of race and racism. Otherwise, it is not specific to being race lighting. It can be a different type of gaslighting. So that's the first key point. Second point, in order for it to be race lighting and not gaslighting, we also have to recognize that it doesn't necessarily occur only at an individual level. What does that mean? Well, so first, let's get to this point. It can be experienced at the individual or group level. So it can be experienced at the individual or group level. So you might be asking yourself, what does that mean? So when we think about gaslighting, gaslighting is typically conceptualized as occurring in a relationship between a man and a woman where the man is the perpetrator, the woman is being victimized by the man, and he is intent upon making her feel as if she is losing her mind. That notion then is really a bi-directional relationship from one person to another person who this one person is trying to influence the mind and processing and reality of another person. And that can be the case when it comes to race lighting as well. It can be at an individual level. It could be, for example, one employer to an employee. It can be a student to another student. It could be a coworker to another coworker. It could be a healthcare professional, such as a doctor or a nurse, to a patient. Ultimately, it can occur at a level where it occurs from one individual to another. But it can also occur and be experienced at a group level. Let's say that you have 3 African Americans who work in the same department for a specific company or business. They may be in this department. Let's say that there's 30 people in this department. There may be multiple individuals who are sending them messages that tell them that they're not good enough, that they don't belong there, that they're not intelligent or capable, that people of color are lazy and they don't care. They're perpetuating these stereotypes over and over and over again. And so it's an accumulation of microaggressions in an environment that makes them feel like maybe they don't belong, like maybe they're not good enough, or maybe this isn't the work that they're cut out to do. So it can be experienced at an individual level, but it can also be experienced in tandem because those three individuals in that department are experiencing race lighting, but they're experiencing it in a group. The second way in which it can be experienced in a group is not necessarily for those who are the recipients, but for those who are perpetuating the actual messages. It doesn't have to be one person in that department who's creating an experience in race lighting three people. It can be an entire community within a department who microaggress their employees, who convey to them that maybe they're prone to criminality or emotionally unstable or less intelligent and capable than others. Again, it's the accumulation of microaggressions that can then lead Black, Indigenous, and people of color to second guess themselves. So race lighting can be experienced at both an individual and group level. And that group level can be both for the perpetrators, but can also be for the recipients, the race lightees themselves. The third way in which it differs from gaslighting is that it can be consciously and unconsciously rendered. So it can be consciously and unconsciously rendered, meaning that the message can be sent from one person to another person with intent, right? Intent, that's consciously, but it can also be sent to a person without intent. It can be unconscious. So, what does that mean? If you have a person who is actually trying to race light someone, in their mind they are trying to send them messages that make them second guess their own experiences and realities, then that can be conscious. And if we think about the history of slavery within this country, for example, the condition of those who were enslaved was one where conscious race lighting was taking place. They were intentionally told that if they didn't obey their masters, that ultimately they were violating the God-ordained relationship between those who were masters and those who were enslaved. And there was even a specific Bible called the Slave Bible, which pulled out sections of the larger Holy Bible and was given to slaves and fed to them through pastors and preachers who specifically were there to convey that the condition that they were in was the condition that they were supposed to be in. Not one of freedom, but one of bondage. And that was a conscious act to disorient the realities of those who were indeed enslaved. It can also be unconsciously rendered. Again, I mentioned that it can be this accumulation of microaggressions in an environment. Microaggressions are not always conscious. They can be unconscious. It can be somebody who says with a sense of surprise, "Oh, wow, you're so articulate. I didn't expect you to know that." That sense of surprise itself is what conveys that underlying message that that person wouldn't be, which then can lead them to second guess themselves. But the person who is conveying that message doesn't necessarily have intent to do so. And this is where we have to separate two other terms for us to truly understand this. Intent from impact. Okay? So you can have a positive intent. In your mind, you can say that I am trying to compliment somebody, I'm trying to affirm them, but even if your intent is meant to be positive, right, it can still be a negative impact on the people that you're trying to serve, because ultimately the outcome that you're producing is one that serves to harm. In your mind, you're complimenting, but in really, you're dissing them. You're putting them down. It's a snuddle snub. Separating intent from impact lets us realize that you can have an unconsciously rendered message that serves to race light a person of color, and there doesn't have to necessarily be intent to go along with it. There oftentimes can be, but that's not always necessarily the case. So again, three primary ways in which we can see this play out. First, the centrality of race and racism serves to distinguish race lighting and gaslighting. It can be experienced at the individual and group level. And third, it can be consciously or unconsciously rendered from the race lighter or race lighters to the race lightee or race lightees. It's important for us to recognize what are some of the common signs of race lighting. What are some things to look for to determine whether or not you or someone else is experiencing race lighting? So one of the ways in which this can occur is through an overwhelming sense of doubt. This is core to the experience of race lighting. It can lead BIPOC to second guess themselves on a range of different issues. First, you can second guess your experiences. You can second guess your feelings. Am I really feeling that? Am I being overly sensitive? Am I in tune with what's really going on? You can second guess your capabilities, whether or not you're cut out to be doing whatever work it is that you're doing. The knowledge that you have in your brain, can I even rely upon my own knowledge, or am I second guessing that knowledge? Your decision making. Did I make the right decision? Did I not make the right decision? It seems I felt like I did make the right decision, but now I'm getting the sense that maybe I didn't. You can second guess your recollections or your memory. Am I remembering this right? I thought that this happened, but now someone is saying that this happened. Is that really what occurred? And even at times, your basic humanity. Am I a person of worth? Your basic humanity can even be second guessed when it comes to race lighting. You can also experience an overwhelming sense of disorientation. An individual can feel a sense of disorientation when experiencing race lighting, where things seem like they're hazy, where the message it seems unclear, where my world itself, I feel disoriented. I don't feel like I'm totally in control of my own life. I just don't know whether I should move this direction or this direction. I feel an overwhelming sense of doubt and disorientation. And that disorientation is associated with a sense of haziness or lack of clarity, which relates back earlier to that concept which I mentioned, which is attribution ambiguity. And remember that attribution ambiguity serves as the doorway into the race lighting experience. You can also feel a general sense of unease. You feel that something is wrong, that something is afoot in a negative sense. It can be associated with anxiety, where now I'm in an environment where I'm constantly second guessing myself. And so there's this elevated level of anxiety that you're going to make a misstep, that you're going to make a mistake, that somehow you're going to end up doing the wrong thing. And as a result, you can even feel like you are under fire. Like individuals within your organization are out to get you, that they are conspiring against you. And this may, of course, be in your mind, but it can also be an actual experience in the case of an active race lighter where they are intentionally trying to make you feel like this. And ultimately, no one performs well under these types of conditions. It can make you feel like you can't get things right. What does that refer to? It refers to this notion that if you're under fire, and anyone who is under fire and is experiencing anxiety, unease, and disorientation and doubt, ultimately those aren't conditions in an environment where someone is going to thrive, where they're going to grow, where they're going to be them best selves. And so if you constantly feel like you're under a microscope and every single thing that you do serves to reinforce a larger narrative that is being created about you by other individuals, you can get to a point where you feel like you can't get things right because you're in an environment that's not conducive for you to be able to get those things right. In some cases, it can lead people to begin avoiding others because you want to protect yourself. You want to make sure that you're in an environment where you feel a sense of safety. And so ultimately, this can impact you in the work environment, in the school environment, whatever environment you might be, because you can want to avoid others because of this notion that whenever I'm around them, I doubt myself, I feel disorientated, I feel this sense of unease and anxiety, I'm under fire and I can't get things right. This can all lead to a sense of hopelessness. Hope is the most powerful thing that we have as human beings. Hope is a powerful thing that we have as BIPOC in a nation that was not designed for us and never really wanted many of us to be here. But hopelessness, when we don't have that ability to be able to feel like there's going to be something better tomorrow, like I'm going to be able to overcome this difficult situation without hope and these conditions, you can see how race lighting can be a detrimental experience to BIPOC. So this brings us to a conversation on the two main types of race lighting. And there are two main types. One type of race lighting is called active race lighting. Active race lighting. This is when someone has the intent upon sending a message that sows doubt and disorientation among the race lightee. It occurs when the perpetrator has the intention of making the race lightee begin to second guess their experiences, their realities, their capabilities, their knowledge, their decision making. There is intent upon this, and it is very similar to what we saw with the play with Jack and Bella, in that Jack was intent upon making Bella feel as if she was losing her mind. With active race lighting, there is an intent upon making the individual feel as if they are losing their mind. But again, these messages are delivered in a way that plays on issues of race or racism in order to make someone feel as if they are losing their mind. This overwhelming sense of doubt, disorientation, and delusion. In addition to that, much of the types of race lighting that we see are actually what we would call passive race lighting. Passive race lighting is very different than active race lighting in that there is not necessarily the same level of intent. It occurs often unintentionally through an accumulation of microaggressions in an environment that can lead someone to feel an overwhelming sense of doubt and disorientation. And this is important because there are three main types, as we've discussed, of microaggressions that are routinely experienced in the lives of Black, Indigenous, and people of color. First, there is an assumption of criminality, where they are assumed to be dangerous, deviant, up to no good. Second, there are ascriptions of intelligence, where they are assumed to be academically inferior, incapable of performing at the levels of other individuals within their school, college, university, organization, company. And the third is second-class citizenship, where they are made to believe that they are lesser than. And we hear this all the time with the they statements. They're lazy. They don't care. They're not really here for school. They're only here for the financial aid. They'll be gone by census. The accumulation of these messages over time can also serve to race light a person passively without necessarily having the intent, but that passive race lighting still has harm on the individuals who receive them. The race lightee, whether it is active or whether it is passive, still experiences those signs of race lighting. There are a number of different conditions that serve to amplify the impact of a race lighting message. These conditions serve to make it so that the message itself is more likely to be believed. So one of the conditions that is really important for us to consider is the authority and or the credibility of the messenger. So the messenger in this case being someone who is race lighting a race lightee. So the authority and the credibility of the race lighter. Let's think about this first in terms of authority. This could be someone who is a boss. This is a supervisor. This is a team lead. This is someone with seniority. This is someone with years of experience in an organization. This is someone who is well respected because of the position that they hold, a high-level position within an organization. And so when someone with authority over you in a particular situation says something, and they say it with the tenacity and authenticity and veracity that these messages are often associated with, it can have a higher level of authority and therefore can amplify the likelihood that the race lightee will believe the message from the race lighter. In addition to that, it can be the credibility of the messenger. So is the messenger someone who has a lot of know-how? Let's say within their respective area, not only do they have these high levels of seniority and experience, but they have the know-how within the organization, right? There's somebody who has a respected perspective where they are generally believed based upon the way that they approach the work that they do, whether it is through a sense of calmness, a sense of confidence in which they convey it. It can be credibility based upon the fact of what's called trait theory. Maybe they're an individual who happens to be a white male who's tall, and so based upon certain traits, that certain things that can be associated based upon extent research that says that the message itself will be perceived as being more credible than if rendered by a woman or a person of color, which is of course unfortunate, but is also a reality. And so ultimately what we can see is that if they know how, they have the know-how within their organization, if they are respected, if they have certain traits that can then lead people to believe the things that they say, then when they send this message to you, or they send this message about you to other individuals, there's something about it that sticks in a different type of way than if it comes from somebody who doesn't have authority within an organization or doesn't have the same level of credibility. So the reputation of the messenger is important. Now, this is where active race lighting and passive race lighting can come in here. In an active race lighting scenario, again, you have somebody who is intent upon sending this message. And so their authority and their credibility will also be reinforced by the messages that they send about the race lightee to other individuals to create a sense of an environment around them that reaffirms or creates a self-fulfilling prophecy around how they should perceive an other individual. So let's say this. Let's say that the individual is a boss and they perceive an employee as being emotionally unstable. This individual is perceived as being emotionally unstable. Not in reality, but that's the message that they want to send. So they talk to this person and they talk with them about, you need to be more in control of your emotions when you're in the work environment. Or why do you get so angry? Why do you get so upset? That's what the message that they would send to the race lightee. But then to other individuals within that organization, they can further reinforce that message by saying similar things. Well, I don't know how they handle themselves under pressure, or they're always angry, they're always upset, they always seem emotionally unstable. And they keep repeating these things. People are looking for things that serve to reinforce it because of the position with this individual within the organization. So the messages that they're sending actually serve to even further reinforce the authority and credibility that they have. So they had it already based upon these characteristics, but then they can further increase their authority and credibility by creating a narrative around you. And that narrative can then lead people to engage in what they perceive to be rational decision making, but in reality, it is confirmation bias. Credibility in that authority can lead people to further believe what they say.
One of the factors that determines whether or not a race lighting message is perceived as reliable is the persistence and the veracity in which the message is rendered. When rendered in a way from the perpetrator to those who they are victimizing, so when conveyed in a manner in which the person seems authentic, they seem very convicted by their perception in terms of what they're saying, it can make a race lighting message more believable and realistic to the race lightee. Interestingly, this can also occur when, in fact, the race lighter is, of course, in the wrong. Some may believe their own distorted reality because oftentimes when it comes to microaggressions, it is hard for people to acknowledge that they have said something or done something to another person that could have been a racial slight or insult. And so when a microaggression is oftentimes brought to someone else's attention, like, hey, you said this to me and this was a microaggression, usually the response isn't to say, oh, you're right, I'm sorry, I recognize I microaggressed you, I want to do differently in the future. It's to instead say, that's not what you heard, you're misunderstanding me, that's not what I said, you're putting words in my mouth, or accuse you of offending them. But it's these defensive actions that take place. And oftentimes it's because an individual, because these messages are rendered unconsciously, not always, but sometimes they are, they may not be fully cognizant of what they have actually said. They may not understand that the message that they're giving has an underlying meaning that is detrimental to the person who it's being rendered to. Another important factor to consider with race sliding messages is that the more identities that a person has that are marginalized identities, the more powerful the combination of those messages might be. So for example, if a person identifies as a person of color, right, there is an identity there based upon their racial identity that is one that is ripe for these race sliding messages. But we also know in the research of microaggressions that microaggressions can be based upon one's gender, one's sexual orientation, one's ability status. And so the more of those additional factors, the more the identity becomes more complex with multiple groups in which the person ascribes to that are marginalized groups, the more intense those messages can be. So intersectional identities with multiple minoritized groups may produce intensified biases and further disparate outcomes, meaning that the impact of that race sliding experience may be even more detrimental. And as a result, the outcomes associated with that, which we'll get to later in this program around racial battle fatigue, can be even more complex and intensified as well. As discussed earlier, racial gaslighting refers to what happens when there are gaslighting experiences in a case law context that are racial in nature. So it's racial gaslighting and has been, as described in the previous research, really focused on what happens when these court cases take place that communicate a specific message to a given community or proactively advance a specific narrative that is in fact disingenuous and sends the wrong message to minoritized communities. We see a bi-directional relationship between that racial gaslighting that can occur in this case law context and down at the interpersonal level, the interpersonal experiences with this phenomenon, which we refer to as race-lighting, in that the larger issues in society, which deal with cases and court rulings, those send certain messages to minoritized communities that reinforce the daily experiences they have in interpersonal relationships with individuals who are different from them, whether it's a supervisor, whether it is a coworker, whether it's someone that you're serving, whatever that capacity might be, those interpersonal experiences are reinforced by what's happening at that macro level. Similarly, the macro level conversations on case law are also informed by these interpersonal experiences that individuals have with race sliding. So there is a bi-directional relationship between racial gaslighting, again, at this more macro level, case law level, and the race sliding experiences at the interpersonal level. We've had the opportunity to publish several different pieces in diverse issues in higher education related to race sliding. One article was titled Race Sliding, 3 Common Strategies that Race Sliders Use, written by myself, Jay Luke Wood, and my colleague, Dr. Frank Harris III. And in this article, we talked about 3 common ways that race sliders use messages to race slide their victims and those who they are targeting. One of the ways in which we talked about is that race sliders weaponize your own voice against you. And as we said in the article, race sliding can be more intense when a victim raises concern about their mistreatment. So let's say, for example, that we have a Native American student employee who has a manager who constantly mistreats them. The student, in conversation with another employee, asks where they can get additional monies to support them in attending college. Overhearing the exchange, the manager interjects and makes a joke to the Native American student about casino money. Rightfully, the student is offended, and the student raises this comment to the awareness of the manager. The response of the manager is to assert with conviction that the student is verbally attacking them, engaging in character assassination, or unduly targeting them. Race sliders will use this strategy to disorient their victims and make them second guess their actions. So when you get to the point where you are ready to voice your perspective and what has occurred, that is used and weaponized against you. The second is that race sliders will weaponize your passions against you as well. As we stated, and as noted by Sarkis 2017, gaslighters often use what is of personal importance to the victim as a weapon against them. But this also occurs with race sliders as well. For example, a Black faculty member who researches and publishes on issues facing Black communities or spends ample time mentoring Black students can have these actions weaponized against them. This is especially the case when such efforts are tied to one's core identity. Race sliders will convey that a person of color's work is less scholarly, not publishable in a quality journal, or that they have a research agenda that is too narrow. Racelighters may also openly raise concern that faculty members spend excessive time on service and are not truly committed to their scholarly pursuits. Ultimately, what they do is they take the inherent joy away from these activities that were held dear by the race lighting. So weaponizing your passions against you. And finally, we also find that race lighters will weaponize your insecurities against you. And it's not uncommon for people of color, as we said in the article, to struggle with what is called imposter syndrome. Imposter syndrome refers to an individual doubting their own abilities, their achievements and talents, in tandem with the concern that others will deem them as a fake or a fraud, that they'll find out that they really truly don't belong, that they're not ready, and that they will find this and they will identify it and it will be raised as a concern. Whether a victim's lack of confidence is with their own writing ability, their speaking ability, their knowledge, their professional experience, the way that they speak, race lighters will intentionally weaponize these insecurities against them. Race lighters will use these insecurities to oppress their victims by magnifying their failures and magnifying their missteps. They'll also create doubt around positive successes by verbally undervaluing these successes, pinpointing holes in them, and questioning the legitimacy of the success. So they will take the things that you feel insecure about and they will weaponize those against you and make those into issues that are perceived as being real. In addition to the authority and credibility of the messenger, there are other amplification factors that we have to consider. It can be the accumulation of messages. Remember that microaggressions and these messages around who a person is and it's framed through these racial stereotypes begin even at the earliest levels of schooling in preschool. So young children experience an accumulation of these microaggressions over their lifespan. And so if we're talking about, for example, a higher education context, this entire life of this individual has been informed and shaped by perceptions around stereotypes and these messages that they receive that are informed by stereotypes. We also mentioned that intersectional identities, the more marginalized identities that a person has in terms of communities that they come from based upon dominant stereotypes and dominant ideologies, that can have an amplification and serve to amplify the experiences that they have with race lighting. At the macro level, we've also talked about racial gaslighting in terms of the case law context, but we also have to recognize that microaggressions can be macro and there can be messages that are sent by wider society, and that microaggressions can be macro level as well. Economic conditions. And we know that there are disparities within society that serve to reinforce stereotypes. And we see those stereotypes even further reinforced through media representation. There can be media representations of people of color that is positive, or it can also be negative. So a lack of positive media representation can then reinforce the credibility and authenticity of the message. And of course, the prison industrial complex can serve to only reify these stereotypes around assumptions of criminality as it plays out for minoritized communities. So altogether, we see that at the macro level and at the micro level, these messages are reinforced by these amplification factors, which make the message seem more credible. And again, the veracity and authenticity and persistence of the message from the messenger can also serve to make it more believable and more realistic. These amplification factors are real. And as you can see, we've now walked through the bulk of the race lighting model. We've started with the antecedents, talking about white supremacy, white nationalism, and how those fuel anti-Blackness and anti-indigeneity, how that ultimately leads to bias in our society. There's explicit bias and implicit bias, and we're communicating those dispositions of bias to one another using microaggressions. There's microassaults, which is good old-fashioned racism, using the N-word. It's a racial epitaph. It's the use of racial imagery such as a swastika or a noose. There's micro insults when we put down and invalidate people of color. We talked about some primary ways in which that occurs through an assumption of criminality, where we assume that students or people of color are dangerous, deviant, up to no good, or have some sort of malintent. We talked about an description of intelligence, where individuals are assumed to be academically inferior or incapable of performing at the levels of other individuals. And we also talked about second-class citizenship, when individuals from communities of color are treated as lesser than, and how second-class citizenship and pathologizing culture can combine together to create this experience for Black students, along with the other microaggressions, which represents distrust, disdain, and disregard. And then micro invalidations when we invalidate the lives, experiences, and realities of people of color. And so we talked about different types of race lighting, active race lighting, and passive race lighting. In the next session, we'll talk about the 4 different types of race lighting, including advancing stereotypes, resistive actions, misrepresenting the past, and inauthentic allyship. And finally, in our model, we also recognize that race lighting serves as the doorway into other negative psychosocial outcomes, including racial battle fatigue, which is a concept that was created by our colleague and friend, Dr. William Smith from the University of Utah, which we'll talk about next. Stereotype threat, where what we find is, and this is based upon the work of Claude Still and Joshua Aronson, that it's this notion that if there is a negative stereotype that's evident within an environment, that there is a fear of that stereotype being reified or made true in that environment. And so as a result, it changes the way that people of color engage in that environment. I learned about this early on in my own research on my dissertation when I interviewed 28 Black men who attended a community college in Arizona. And as part of that interview study, I asked men what affected their success in college. And oftentimes, many of them would say the extent to which they were engaged in the classroom. And so wanting to hear more about that, I said, well, please tell me more. And they would say, well, sometimes a faculty member will ask a question and I'll know the answer, but I won't say anything. And sometimes they'll have gone over some new information on the board, a new model, a theory, and they'll say, does anybody have any questions? And I'll know that I have questions, but again, I won't say anything. And sometimes they'll say, hey, if you need support, come and see me in my office hours, and I'll know that I need to go, but I won't go. And of course, as a researcher, I would say, well, why is that? And they would say, well, because they'll think I'm dumb. They'll think I'm ignorant. They'll think I'm stupid. They were worried about reifying these stereotypes in their environment to the point where they were apprehensive to engage in the classroom. They weren't disengaged. They weren't dispassionate about their education. They were, in fact, very committed and very engaged in their learning process, but they were worried about that engagement leading to reifying stereotypes about their group within that environment. And then we also have talked just already about imposter syndrome, when individuals are worried about the fact that people will identify that they don't belong, that they're not good enough, that they're a fake or they're a fraud, and that will somehow become known because their confidence has been put down so frequently in that environment that they feel like they are nothing more but an imposter. And this brings us to racial battle fatigue. So racial battle fatigue, according to the model, is one of the ultimate outgrowths of all the antecedents of racism, the explicit bias, the microaggressions, the race lighting experience, and ultimately all of this points to an outcome in terms of how it impacts people. And so racial battle fatigue is a concept that was created by William Smith from the University of Utah. And it's a framework for making sense of the ways that racism, whether it's explicit, whether it's implicit, whether it's mundane, has an impact on us, recognizing that those impacts occur in 3 different areas: cognitive impacts, emotional impacts or psychological impacts, and physiological impacts, physical impacts as well. Now, what Dr. Smith has found is that the impacts of race and racism on an individual are akin to the impacts that are seen from combat stress syndrome. And in fact, that's why the term is called racial battle fatigue. This stress is akin to combat stress syndrome that is seen by military personnel, in which there are mental, emotional, and physiological injuries that occur as a result of being in an environment where there is a persistent risk or persistent stress. Of course, when it comes to combat stress syndrome, that persistent risk and persistent stress is associated with the war zone. When it comes to racial battle fatigue, it's associated with all the environments that individuals are in where there is a persistent racial stress and risk. So the impacts can, first of all, be cognitive. It can impact the ability of your mind to be able to process information, to be able to retain information, and your attentional focus. So think about the manifold ways in which that could impact the learning of an individual in a learning environment. But the risks can also be psychological in nature: constant anxiety and worrying, increased swearing and complaining, a loss of confidence, frustration, denial, emotional and social withdrawal, anger suppression, resentment. These are the ways in which these messages serve to build up within individuals and have negative psychological outcomes. In addition to the cognitive and psychological outcomes, there's also physical outcomes, physiological symptoms that can happen as well. They can include a tension headache, backaches, elevated heartbeats, an upset stomach, extreme fatigue, loss of appetite, elevated blood pressure, and inability to be able to sleep. I hear individuals who experience these symptoms of racial battle fatigue who talk about clenching their jaws at night or having the shakes in the middle of the night. So there can be a physiological response that an individual is having to environments when they're exposed to environments of race and racism. What's even more interesting is that while we think about these symptoms as being applied to adults, we have even seen the manifestation of this even in the earliest levels of schooling. So let's say that you have a young boy who is in kindergarten. He's a Black male, and he's constantly being used as an example of what not to do, how not to act, how not to learn with other students. Well, he's in an environment where he doesn't know how to say to his parents in the evening, well, you know what? I don't want to go to school tomorrow because I'm experiencing microaggressions in my environment. He doesn't have the words yet to say to his parent, I don't feel a sense of belonging in school. I don't like to go there. Can we look at alternative school options? He doesn't have the language yet to say that, but what he does know how to say to his parents in the morning is, I don't want to go to school. And his parents might say, why is that? Why don't you want to go to school? And he says, because I have a headache, or I have a stomach ache, or my stomach hurts. Ultimately, what's happening is that his body is having a physical response to an environment that's unwell and unhealthy. All of this matters in terms of racial microaggressions and race-lighting because the long-term physiological, cognitive, and psychological outcomes can be detrimental for BIPOC. And that concludes Chapter 2, an introduction to race-lighting. In the next session, we will talk about the different types of race-lighting as broken up into 4 different key areas: misrepresenting the past, resistive actions, inauthentic allyship, and advancing stereotypes. See you in the next session. Thank you.